These chapters of the book of Genesis are part of the Bible that we're all familiar with to a large degree. We know, of course, the story of creation, the account that is given, first of all, on a day-by-day basis in Genesis chapter 1, and then the account of the creation of the Garden of Eden and the placement of man there and the creation of Eve. We're familiar with that. We know the story of Cain and Abel. I suppose most of us would, upon thinking about it, realize we know an awful lot of the story of Cain and Abel almost by heart, even without having tried to memorize it. We certainly know the story of the flood, stretching through Genesis chapters 6 through 9. We know the account of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. In fact, probably about the only parts of these early chapters of Genesis that we would really feel a little uneasy in are the genealogies in chapters 5 and 10, because we tend to, once we recognize that it's a genealogy, move on in our study a lot of times. And, of course, in one sense, these chapters of the book of Genesis are studied a great deal. But I think what often happens, first of all, in our Bible study generally, we tend to study the Bible in little bitty bits and pieces without seeing the larger picture and seeing how things fit into the overall story of the Bible, the overall story of our salvation. And I think another thing that happens, especially in these early chapters of Genesis, is the questions that we ask and that we want to have answered when we study these chapters are often not the things that God is trying to tell us in these chapters. For example, I think almost always when I have studied these early chapters, a tremendous amount of time has been consumed in discussing the theory of evolution and the biblical account of creation. And that's certainly important, given our society today and the way in which the theory of evolution permeates not only the scientific world, but the whole social attitude of things, so that man less and less is thought of as distinctly man made in the image of God, more and more thought of just as another one of the animals. The moral dilemma that comes to our society because of that, that's certainly a crucial and important thing for us to deal with. But we so often look, and we want to know the answer to questions like, where was the Garden of Eden? Or we want to know the answer to where did man start fire? Or we want to know, where did Cain get his wife? And we have a whole series of questions that are, you might say, our questions when we come to this, that once again, I think, cause us oftentimes to miss the main point of what God is telling us in these chapters. And when you think about it, it's really remarkable how little the Bible tells us about that period before the time of Abraham. We don't know how much time is involved. There are at least a few thousand years between the time of Adam and creation and the time of Abraham. My own feeling is, though this is another one of those questions we want to get answered that the Bible really doesn't try to answer, when did creation take place? My own feeling is it's probably more than a few thousand years, but how much more, I really don't know. But the point is, out of however much time that is between the time of Abraham and Adam, we've only got these 11 chapters. And that's a remarkably small amount of material. We think about, you come to the New Testament and you think about the Apostle Paul. You think how much we know about and how much God tells us about his life. The whole last half of the book of Acts tells us about his travels. We've got about 15 chapters there in Acts devoted to the travels of Paul. And then we think about all the letters that Paul wrote, how much we know about the life of Paul. And yet Paul lived about like we do, probably about 60-something years, maybe 70, who knows, somewhere in that ballpark. On the other hand, you think about Adam lives for 900 years. Now, surely a lot of things happened in 900 years. And yet we've really just got 2-3 chapters telling us about Adam. And for the other people, with the exception of Noah, even less. Sometimes just a verse or two about some incident in their life. And we're aware that really, once you start thinking about it, you realize, now God just told us just a little handful of things out of all of the things that he could have told us. All of the things that maybe we sometimes wish he had told us to answer all of our questions, modern questions. He told us just these things. We say, what is he trying to tell us? What is really the revelation to us from God in these early chapters of Genesis. And I believe that the purpose of these chapters, particularly starting with the sin of man in Genesis chapter 3 and going through Genesis chapter 11, the real purpose of those chapters was for God to impress upon us what the consequences of sin really are. Because the whole story of the Bible is really about how we can be saved from sin. I mean, everything after man sins in Genesis chapter 3, everything thereafter is leading up to the coming of Christ and is preparing for telling us how we can be delivered from sin. And that story is really going to, you might say, start forward when we get to Genesis chapter 12 with the promise that God makes to Abraham, that through his seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And we'll come eventually, we'll trace then, the rest of the Bible, we'll trace the seed of Abraham. And it will come all the way down until we're introduced to Christ. And Paul will tell us that Jesus is the seed of Abraham that had been promised, and it's through him we have our salvation from sin. But before we're going to really appreciate what it means to be saved from sin, we've got to have some sense of what the consequences of sin really are. We speak sometimes of the curse of sin, the curses that God pronounced there in Genesis chapter 3. Well, what are those curses? What happens to us because of sin? And I'm going to say that most of the things I'm going to suggest, I mean, they're not new things by any means. But maybe we've never thought of how clearly they are presented to us in these chapters of Genesis. And that's really what I want to talk about with you from these chapters.